If you've watched this channel for any length of time, you've probably heard me talk about red flags. The things I missed, the things I ignored, the things that seem obvious now, but somehow weren't obvious when I was living through them. For a long time, I blamed myself for that. I thought maybe I was naive. Maybe I was too trusting. Maybe I wanted the relationship to work so badly that I just refused to see what was right in front of me. But the older I've gotten, and especially after my life fell apart, I've spent a lot of time trying to understand why I missed things that seem so obvious now. Because when I look back, honestly, some of the things that should have felt alarming didn't feel alarming at all. They felt familiar. And that's what I've been thinking a lot about lately. I've spent years digging through my own experiences, trying to understand why I tolerated certain things. Why I stayed as long as I did. Why I kept second guessing myself. Why I always seemed to assume I was the problem. And I'll be honest with you, even after all this self-reflection, I still questioned whether I was crazy for thinking this. I wondered if I was digging so deeply into my own life that I was creating explanations that weren't really there. I wondered if I was simply trying to make sense of what happened after my marriage ended. I wondered if this was just me, or if other people saw this in themselves too. So I posted a poll, and I asked, have you ever looked back at a relationship and realized the chaos only felt normal because you grew up around emotional instability? And honestly, I didn't know what to expect. I figured some people would relate. Maybe a few comments, maybe a handful of people would say yes. But instead, 88% of the people who responded basically said some version of yes. Not maybe, not sort of, yes. And honestly, that was a relief because for years, I wasn't sure if I was discovering something real about myself or if I was simply digging so deep into my own life that I was creating explanations that weren't really even there. I wondered if I was crazy. I wondered if I was rewriting history. I wondered if I was trying to make some sense of pain after the fact. I wondered if this was just my experience. Then hundreds of people looked at that question and basically said, nope, that's exactly what happened to me too. And that stopped me dead in my tracks. Because suddenly, this wasn't just something floating around in my head. This wasn't just me trying to explain my own story. It was something a lot of people recognized in themselves. When I was younger, I never would have described my life as emotionally unstable. It was just life. It was normal. The environment that we grew up in becomes our measuring stick. You don't know it's unusual because it's all you've ever known. You don't know it's unhealthy because nobody handed you a healthier example or gave you an instruction manual. You simply adapt. You learn how to navigate it. You learn how to survive it. And survival skills are funny things. The skills that help us survive one environment often follow us into another. When I look back at it now, I think that's exactly what happened to me. Not just in relationships, in confidence, in self worth, in trusting my own instincts. in speaking up for myself. And I don't mean in general situations, because generally speaking, I've never been afraid to stand up for myself. You know, I've never been the guy who would back down from a bully. And I've never had a problem speaking my mind when I believed in something. You know, if somebody was mistreating somebody else, I'd step in. You know, if I thought something was wrong, I'd say it. And that's not what I'm talking about. That was different. This was confidence in my own reality. You know, confidence in my own instincts, confidence in my own feelings, confidence in my ability to say something doesn't feel right here. And trust myself enough to actually believe it. Because if you spend enough years adapting to emotional instability, you can become really good at reading other people. You know, you become aware of moods, tension, changes in energy. You learn how to keep the peace. Excuse the airplane going overhead, folks. Of course, that's how it works. But anyway, you learn how to adjust yourself. You learn how to avoid conflict. You know, you learn how to make yourself smaller when necessary. What you don't necessarily learn is how to trust yourself. And I think that's exactly why I missed so many red flags. Because the things that should have felt wrong didn't feel wrong. They felt familiar. You know, walking on eggshells felt familiar. Feeling responsible for someone else's emotions felt, familiar. You know, questioning myself felt familiar. Trying harder every time things went sideways felt familiar. Making excuses for behaviors that shouldn't need excuses felt familiar. You know, those things didn't trigger alarm bells. They triggered recognition. And that's a dangerous thing. Because when something feels familiar, we often mistake it for normal. At least I know I did. You know, I can remember times during my marriage when something inside me, you know, knew something wasn't right. You know, I couldn't always put my finger on it, but something felt off. And instead of trusting that feeling, I just, I questioned it. You know, I told myself I was overreacting. I told myself every relationship has problems. Told myself maybe I just needed to be more patient, more understanding, more forgiving. You know, but the common denominator in all of it was that I always doubted myself first. I trusted my own judgment so little that I automatically assumed that I was wrong. And when I look back at that, I don't think that came from that relationship. You know, I think that relationship took advantage of something that was already there. That's a hard thing to admit because, it's easier to tell ourselves that the relationship created all the damage. But sometimes the relationship finally or simply finds the cracks that already existed. And for me, one of those cracks was trust. Not trust in other people, trust in myself. Because the truth is, I saw more than I gave myself credit for. You know, I noticed things, I felt things, I questioned things. The problem wasn't that I couldn't see them. The problem was that I didn't trust myself when I did. And that one realization changed everything for me. Because suddenly I stopped asking, how could I be so blind? And I started asking, why didn't I trust what I was seeing? Those are very different questions. The crazy thing is that even after leaving, I still spent years second guessing myself. Even when I could see the patterns, even when I could see the damage, you know, even when the evidence was staring me straight in the face. Part of me still wondered if I was remembering things wrong. You know, maybe you've experienced that too. You finally get distance from the relationship and you finally start seeing things more clearly. And then your brain starts negotiating against your own experience. Was it really that bad? Am I being unfair? Maybe I'm exaggerating. Maybe I'm the problem. I know I did that for a long time. But here's what I've learned. Healing isn't just understanding what happened. Healing is learning to trust your own experience. Learning that what you felt actually mattered. Learning that just because something felt normal doesn't mean it's healthy. Learning that familiar and healthy aren't the same thing. And honestly, that's one of the biggest breakthroughs that I've had over the last few years. It's changed my whole life's direction. It's not about understanding narcissism. And it's not really about understanding toxic relationships. It's understanding myself, understanding why I stayed, understanding why I doubted myself, understanding why I missed things that seem so obvious now. Because once I understood that something, actually changed, the shame started disappearing. The self-blame started disappearing. And I stopped asking, what's wrong with me? And I started asking, what happened to me that made this all feel normal? That's a very different question. And for me, it was a much more useful one. Maybe that's exactly why that poll hit me so hard. Because for years, I thought, this might just be my story. Then hundreds of people looked at that question and basically said, nope, that's my story too. And maybe that's the point. Sometimes the things that we think make us crazy are actually the things that connect us to other people. Sometimes the realization that we've been questioning for years is the exact realization somebody else needs to hear. And if there's one thing that I've learned through all of this, it's that the moment that I stopped doubting my own experience was the very moment that I finally started healing. Folks, I'm not a guru in anything. This is about me. This is about what happened for me and what worked for me. And my goal here is to just hope that maybe you get some value out of it. And just maybe your own story can change simply by thinking about these things. And that's it. That's what this is about. Thank you.